So Kanya, just let me know if I can start and if we have started the live streaming.
Yes, Atin, we are live now. You can start.
All right. Okay. All right. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Atin. I work with Center for Science and Environment. So I'm going to be your host today. So this webinar is essentially about debriefing all of you about what happened in the fifth INC. Now, for those of you who are not really been following the entire discussion, just to give you a quick summarized version of what we are going to discuss today. You all are aware that the endeavor to develop a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution globally, including in the marine environment, has been continuing under the leadership of United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP. So the journey towards the Global Plastic Treaty started in 2022 with involvement of as many as 193 member states under the United Nations Environment Assembly. So that's typically an institutional arrangement to discuss around the pressing environmental issues and take decisions thereof. So UNIA is basically an institutional arrangement under the broader umbrella of UNEP. Now, following the historic UNIA Resolution 5/14, which was adopted in March 2022, the decision to develop a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution was taken. And it was an offshoot of this resolution that the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, was born. And the INC was tasked to deliver the legally binding treaty by 2025. Now, the traditional narrative of plastic waste management, which we believed that plastic is a waste problem, was also shifted to dealing with plastic pollution in its entire life cycle, which essentially means right from plastic production to final disposal. Now, since 2022, the INC met 5 times, ideally once in every 6 months. The last and the fifth INC got concluded only last week on the 1st of December 2024 in Busan, South Korea. CSC team, including myself, was part of it. The fifth INC was supposed to deliver the treaty, but it could not. Instead, it delivered another version of the text, technically being termed as the chair's text, which will be the basis of the next round of negotiations sometime next year. And we hope that the next round will be able to deliver the treaty. Now, there are many questions that we are contemplating as of now in presence of a wonderful panel to deliberate on why the fifth INC could not deliver what it was mandated to deliver. What are the geopolitical factors that eventually slowed down the process, and what is there in the chair's text, and whether the chair's text has all the elements that covers the upstream, midstream, and downstream issues typically termed as the full life cycle of plastic. So in the panel, we have wonderful friend and colleague Dharmesh Shah from the Center for International Environmental Law. We have a good friend and colleague Lars Stodel from Grid Arendal, Norway. And I am also joined by my senior colleague and who leads all our plastic work and plastic research, Siddharth. So the webinar will be mostly question and answer based, free-flowing, discussion based, and we will encourage all of you to post your questions for the panel, which we shall discuss after the panel has made their interventions, and we shall try and take as many questions as possible. Now, let me give the floor to my senior colleague, Siddharth, who will also moderate the discussion with the other panelists. I'll come back later, maybe with the questions from all of you. So please post in your question, preferably in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, because if you post the question in the Q&A box, it's easier for us to pick it up and then channelize it to the respective panelist. So Siddharth, the floor is now yours. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Atin, and welcome to all the participants. So unlike every other CSE webinar, the format for this webinar is slightly different. We do not have any presentations, but it is going to, this discussion is primarily going to reflect on a lot of things that have happened throughout the INC process, right, from INC 1 to INC 5. But before we dive deeper into what really unfolded at INC 5, I would invite Dharmesh to kindly give an overview of of basically what the Global Plastic Treaty is, what does it aim to achieve, and why is it crucial for tackling the problem of plastic pollution?
Thank you, Siddharth, and thank you, Atin. My name is Dharmesh Shah. I'm the senior campaigner with Center for International Environmental Law. And to quickly answer your question on what the Plastics Treaty aims to achieve, and one important term we use to refer to the Plastics Treaty quite often is legally binding. And the idea of legally binding was that we needed a global treaty that had that imposed legally binding obligations on countries, because the plastics crisis, what was recognized by countries who are party to the UN, that this crisis is not, it's very hard to, it has been proven very difficult to resolve, just left to countries, and that we needed coordinated global action, which imposed certain legally binding obligations on countries. So that is the main purpose of this treaty, is to impose legally binding obligations on countries. Now, when you say what kind of obligation, so the key issues, and there are several issues in that are being discussed right now in the negotiations. But if you look at the top priorities of countries, number one is to reduce the production of virgin plastic polymers by implementing targets to dramatically reduce the production of new virgin plastics. And this is the number one kind of priority of the treaty, because there's acknowledgement across more than 100 countries now that this crisis cannot be addressed without addressing the overproduction of plastics. The second second topic of concern is the regulation of toxic chemicals. Now, all of us who've been working on plastics for so long, or people, even now, there's very common knowledge now that all the plastics contain chemicals, and a lot of them are toxic chemicals that are harmful to human health and the planet. So this is a second key intervention that the treaty is seeking, is a ban on hazardous chemicals in plastics. A lot of them are endocrine disruptors and carcinogens, and their regulation is required to protect human health and environment. And then the other key issues are standardizing regulations. So to establish universal criteria for product design, labeling, recycling. Now, all these things are being done by each country based on their own assessment of how these things should be done, and the legislations around them are extremely chaotic. So the treaty is also a way to kind of standardize some of these key issues and around design, labeling, and recycling. The other key issue was waste trade, which, while we have the Basel Convention and other treaties that look at waste trade, but here we also have additional regulations that are required, strict regulations on plastic waste exports, because what we're experiencing across the global south is this kind of a waste tyranny, or what they're calling waste colonialism. Global north countries are dumping literally millions of tons of waste in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, even India, Bangladesh. So this needs to be addressed, and the treaty will try to address this. So and of course we'll talk about finance later. So there is also the treaty is also aiming to ensure that there's enough financial and technical support for countries that need resources, especially developing countries and small island developing nations, to implement the obligations on the treaty. So I'll stop there and happy to answer more questions on this.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Dharmesh, for that explaining what the treaty basically aims to achieve in a nutshell. So just for the people, because I see a lot of a lot of people are still joining. So I'll just summarize. The key asks is production reduction, regulation of toxic chemicals, standardizing regulation, which probably will come through designing our products, plastic products better, waste trade, which to some extent is covered by Basel Convention, and obviously resource mobilization. To give one very one subtle example is that about the Nordic Council of Ministers report, it said that 141 countries across the globe have some kind of single-use plastic ban in place within the country. India is also one of those countries, but we know that all these countries are struggling to implement the ban because we do not have consistency across the globe. So we see people when they come to forums like the INC and other such similar forums, they keep complaining that we've banned it, right? But because our borders are porous, we continue to receive uh, primary plastic polymers or maybe carry bags made from virgin plastic. They still penetrate our borders, which has become very difficult. So I think what Dharmesh basically said is, uh, and Dharmesh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is having this consistency in the law will help every member state to implement it in a much better manner. So yeah.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely right. So the issue of single-use plastics is also something that is being addressed by the treaty text, and thanks for bringing that up, Siddharth, because the treaty, there's alignment across countries that there has to be some way of phasing out non-essential single-use plastics and what they call problematic plastic products, right? But while countries in different parts of the world have eliminated certain things, like plastic bag ban is something that's most popular,
Yeah.
but there's no standard criteria. What goes into assessing what's problematic and what's not? Like, is it okay to just end at banning plastic bags? Because we know that there's so many other single-use plastic items that are unnecessary, problematic, and are posing harm. In countries like India, is the sachets that we have shampoo and all the other conditioners and everything being sold. Massive pollution caused by that. So each country will have a different way of approaching this, but yes, there's a global need to phase out non-essential single-use problematic plastics.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Dharmesh. Now, if I can turn to Lars and just ask him if there are a lot of individuals back in India, and I'm sure a lot of people who are working in this domain of environmental conservation, but all of them might not have the bandwidth, the time, energy to follow this process very closely. So, for individuals who want to understand, who are new to this process, could you just throw some light on what a legally binding treaty on plastic pollution would mean in practical terms for stakeholders, including governments, industries, citizens? If you can throw some light on that, Lars.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thanks for inviting me today. And yes, I will try to shed some light on this. Although I think we've touched on it already a bit in the first question. I mean, essentially, a legally binding instrument means that countries who ratify this instrument or who sign up to be sort of part of it makes an obligation to introduce this in their national laws and regulations and policies. So there's an obligation to actually then take forward the measures that are agreed upon in the instrument. So in other words, as Dharmesh was pointing to, if one manages to establish common criteria across all countries on chemicals of concern, on product design, on supply and production issues, it means that those countries who are signed up to the instrument are obliged to take them forward. So of course, that has implications for industries, in those countries, in as far as what they are allowed to introduce in plastic products, for example, in terms of the chemicals, or how they might what the design would look like of those products, to make them perhaps more to make reuse more possible, refill systems to make them more recyclable, etc. So of course, as we've already mentioned, the plastics treaty is attempting to deal with a very complex but also very sort of very harmful problem of plastic pollution. So I think for citizens, what it might mean in the long term is that of course we don't have products anymore that contain harmful chemicals, or they might find that products are designed differently, or maybe some particularly those problematic plastic products, single-use products, or certain types of packaging, or other products that are perhaps not necessary to the same extent, that they may not be able, we may not find them anymore in the shops. I mean, that's the essentially the outcome, and so it entails of course, on the one hand, sort of a change in availability of certain types of products. It will also mean, I think, for citizens to some extent, some changes to their lifestyles, perhaps, or maybe less dependency on certain types of products. So that's in a nutshell. So it really means for countries that are part or become part of this, that there's an obligation to really introduce concrete measures in national regulation and policies to really sort of grapple with this, or tackle this issue in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lars, for those inputs. I think one very key aspect of this treaty is also that different kinds of entities have come together, and they try to raise their voices in terms of concerns that they have. So one such initiative is being led by CL, which has a coalition for all the stakeholders, right holders, and civil societies. There's also a coalition that is talking about the demands of the local governments and governments at subnational level. And there's also a coalition that is talking about all the demands from the businesses. And it's very interesting to see that just right before INC 5, the business coalition actually came up with a very ambitious ask from the committee, where they also did mention that we are in favor of production cuts. We are in favor of standardization of product design. And we have, in fact, Lars, we've seen this actually play a very critical role in countries like Norway, where businesses have come together and they have basically regulated themselves. They've self-regulated themselves just to evade the high amounts of environmental compensation that is basically levied on them if they do not follow. In terms of the percentage of collect back that they have to do. So could you just also slightly mention about that if
Yep.
you are fine? Yeah.
Sure. No, thank you. Yes, the Business Coalition was formed actually at the very beginning of the INC process, alongside with the coalition. The Scientist Coalition was also around the same time. So we really saw at the onset some strong voices from communities or from stakeholders that really wanted to make an input into the process. And I think what the business coalition really is looking for, I mean, it's formed by a group of some very large businesses and key players. I think what they're looking for is really a coherent global set of rules that provides a level playing field for businesses to operate within. Of course, there are, essentially, unless such a level playing field is established, you will always have some businesses who are really committed and go very far in sort of implementing sustainability practices, but then you will also have those that are not. And I think, for example, an issue, I mean, like plastics. I mean, some of the measures that are being proposed, they entail additional cost for businesses. So unless you have those, unless you have a global level playing field, you will always have other businesses who then exploit that to their benefit. So I think that's but we are seeing quite a strong, I would say, commitment by businesses through the business coalition. So
yeah. Thank you so much, Lars, for that. So we'll just steer the discussion towards what really unfolded in INC5, and just to give all the attendees an overview. This was the fifth meeting, and it was supposed to deliver the final text, which would be then opened up for signing and ratification. But that did not happen. However, I mean, it is a very complicated process where we are trying to get 193 countries on the table and trying to find common ground. But over the last 2 years, since March 2022, when the decision of adopting or formation of this committee and then negotiations at the INC started, we've had as many as 4 different documents, starting from the potential options for elements, the zero draft, followed by the revised zero draft, followed by the compilation text. And then in a masterstroke, what really happened just before INC5 is a 77-page long document, now basically compressed into a 17-page document, which was easier to negotiate on the basis of, and basically was also, to some extent, I would say, successful in capturing the demands of each and every member state. And in the chair's own words, nobody was really happy with the non-paper, right? So on this note, I just would want Dharmesh to come in to just help us understand what really is a non-paper first, and how is the chair's text that the committee has kind of agreed to be the basis for the next round of negotiation. If you could just throw some light on this, Dharmesh, and then the actual question that I have for you is, how did the geopolitics actually play out during the negotiations? And was there anything surprising or unexpected that you found during this round of negotiations? Strictly keeping in mind that, countries have been asking for something depending on their economic priorities, economic interests. So over to you, Dharmesh. This.
Thanks for that. So on the non-paper, so let's kind of look at what the treaty text is, what all the countries are negotiating right now, and that has to come from somewhere. And what you refer to as the compilation text was a culmination of the first 3 rounds of discussions between countries. And the compilation text was a unwieldy document, because what happened was, because of several issues around decision making, which I'll talk about a bit later if we get a chance, on consensus versus voting. which was a very, very touchy issue throughout the INC process. What we ended up with was a very bulky document with a lot of brackets. Now, when you have brackets in a negotiation text like this, it means it's unagreed text. So what countries ended up doing, especially countries that had lower ambition, was they started bracketing huge chunks of text and also adding a lot of text to it. So it kind of became a very, very impractical way to move forward. And the non-paper, what we call the non-paper, was the chair's offering to simplify the process. It is not a mandate by the committee. So the chair did this on his own. It was an effort, it was an offering, and the countries were free to reject that completely. But there was an agreement to move ahead with that. We did not succeed because there was 3 other iterations of the chair's non-paper during the week we spent in Busan. The last one was what finally we agreed to use as a basis for the next round, which is the resume session in 5.2, because we ended up with no text in this particular round of negotiations. So at this point, it's fair to say that the non-paper offers a good structure to move forward. The content of this could come from either the compilation text or what we call conference room papers, which are submissions by countries on the text they would like to see. So they could make official submissions on each obligation as conference room papers. And that will then be put up added to the text, and then again negotiations start. So it's an ongoing process. So what we end up with at the end of the second round of the resume session is hard to say at this point, but it's also fair to say that there is progress, because we have not not stuck with the compilation text. We've moved and accepted the chair's non-paper as a way forward, and now we have a somewhat a clear path forward, hopefully. And on the geopolitics, generally giving there's a lot of moving pieces, and as people who following international negotiations, be the climate talks or the CBD, which is the biodiversity COP, or this particular process, countries, there's geopolitics, and there's a lot of spillover, from the different spaces into these, there's a lot of connections we need to draw between what happens in the climate versus what happens CBD, and what happens what happened in Busan. And this was quite clear in the issue on the topic of financial mechanisms specifically, but we can talk about that a bit later. On the key flashpoints, we had the major points of contention were production caps, which is there were countries who could not agree on the issue of production caps or production limits on polymer production. And there was a debate between what the scope of the treaty should be, production limits or waste management. Should it go upstream, or should it just focus on collecting the waste that we're making and making this a treaty that basically focuses downstream? But over 100 countries, including the European Union, PSID, Pacific Islands, small island developing nations, many African group of countries, and countries like Norway, Mexico, Panama pushed for binding limits on plastic production, because they recognize that this is the root cause of the crisis. The countries that opposed this were there's a bloc led by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kuwait, Russia, and other Gulf Cooperation Council countries that collectively referred to themselves as a like-minded group, and they made interventions as a like-minded group, and they opposed any production limits. They argued that the treaty should focus solely on waste management, and this was a strategic pivot for them, because they're all petrochemical producing countries and nations, have huge investments in petrochem and assets, and for them, looking at the renewable energy transition that's happening globally, plastics is a lifeline for the survival of that industry. and their markets. Also, a special point on the fact that they were about on the presence of industries and the fossil fuel industry. And that there, I think we need to make a little bit of distinction. The industry that is positively looking and engaging with the treaty are the FMCG companies. But there is the other phase, which is the petrochemical producers, Dow Chemicals, Exxon, DuPont, all these big guys, and they've come together under the groups like the American Chemistry Council, for instance. They are vehemently opposed to any progressive obligations or measures under the treaty. So there we saw about 220 industry representatives, or what we call lobbyists, and we kind of recorded them in the list of participants that was shared. And they in many ways significantly influenced the talks, and this was reminiscent of the climate negotiations. Many people who have been to the climate negotiations said that we saw an overwhelming presence of lobbyists there as well, especially big fossil fuel companies. And this is a special area of concern because we have friendly companies, but we also have this very big block of companies that are trying to derail negotiations as much as possible. The other important flashpoint was the consensus versus voting, which I kind of touched upon briefly, but I'll probably talk about it now. Is the negotiations by default proceeded by consensus because what happened as a result was it allowed a minority of nations to block progress, what I referred to as earlier the like-minded countries. They opposed, they used consensus mechanism to oppose any progressive text in the treaty. And what ended up happening was there was a deadlock in the negotiations and things didn't move forward. And this has been a consistent problem across different INCs, and it played out here as well. So this remains a very, very problematic procedural issue as far as the INC goes. We had a lot of countries that advocated for including some kind of a voting or at least having discussions on how we can decide on some of these contentious issues through a voting mechanism. But again, the like-minded countries firmly oppose this, calling for the treaty to be as inclusive as possible and consensus-based as possible. So this significantly reduced the or delayed the progress in the discussions. The last thing, of course, major concern from as observers we had was about how most of the sessions in this particular INC were behind closed doors, or what the sessions that we call the informal sessions, where observers were not allowed, and this is where a lot of the discussions, crucial discussions happen. So this is a major concern because when things happen behind closed doors, there's very little scrutiny. Member states do not feel like they're accountable to the people that have voted them to power. So there's a inherent issue with having these international treaty negotiations happen behind closed doors. So we need to continue demanding that any future sessions happen in public with participation of observers. So I'll end there and happy to answer more questions about the future.
Yeah, Lars, I guess you have to add something. Please go ahead.
Thank you. No, I mean, Dharmesh has made an excellent summary. I just wanted to, I just echo a couple of things. I think this, for those of us who have followed this process since the beginning, it was quite a relief to see that there was actual progress being made in the form of actually discussing what the text might look like, the text of this treaty. So we have been through INC 1 to 4, and what we have seen is this mushrooming of a compilation, which, as Dharmesh mentioned, amounted to 77 pages and thousands of brackets, meaning text that is not agreed. So now, through the initiative of the chair, by introducing the non-paper, we actually started to see, the contours of what the agreement might look like. So that is a very good step forward. And I think, I mean, while of course we continue to be impatient and we would like to see more speed, I think the fact that we now have a bit more time in the form of the next another session of INC 5. In fact, it's just a continuation of INC 5, just in a different location. Hopefully, that should give us or give member states enough time to find agreement. And then, of course, the one issue to really look out for is the consensus versus voting. And here, I think the word is really out. We don't. There's really very difficult to predict what might take place. I mean, in theory, the draft rules procedure, meaning the procedures that are governing the process, they apply. So one member state or a member state or countries can request a vote on procedural or substantive issues. So we just have not gotten to that step or that time yet. I think there's nothing yet to vote on, of course, but that will be very interesting to see how that plays out. The commitment to a consensus-based agreement is still very strong. I find that even though, of course, we have many countries that are standing up for ambition, literally speaking, we will need to see, I think, how that plays out, because there's also a commitment here to the multilateral process in and of itself. Especially UNEP, UN-based or UN processes or convened by the UN, the consensus-based or multilateral approach is of course one of the key added values of a UN-led process. So how that might play out in the nature of the agreement, we will maybe touch on that a bit later. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight those couple of things. Thank you.
Yeah. Atin, you have to add something. I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I had a small question to both Dharmesh and Lars. Since I was also part of the INC process, in the second INC, where
I think so that
basically, so basically, where almost half of the entire duration of the second INC in Paris, if I'm not wrong, was kind of used or wasted, or whichever way you say, on discussion around the rules of procedure. Now, as I understand from the intervention of both Dharmesh and Lars, that it is still provisional, and there are more countries who are more skewed towards a consensus-based legal instrument rather than voting-based. But my small question to you is that, I mean, it's difficult to imagine that 193 nations will arrive at consensus on everything or every article, every provision of the treaty. And what we can see, I mean, if we see the zero draft to the chair's text, the transition already has observed a lot of dilution, a lot of ambitious elements being compromised. So do both of you think that in our pursuit to arrive at a consensus-based agreement, will eventually compromise an ambitious treaty which will actually address the full life cycle of plastic and not just plastic as a waste product?
Dharmesh first, or
I can just quickly to respond to that. I think you're right when you said, then that how do we arrive at a consensus-based outcome when we have 183 countries. And right now, if you're looking at consensus as a default and not having voting even as a last resort, then you are destined to have a treaty that is defined by the ambition of the lowest denominator. So you have countries that even one country can veto progress at this point, right? So that is certainly not a good way forward, even in a multilateral space, because the ability to make decisions, including voting as a last resort, is essential for progress in the plastics treaty. And it is true for many other treaties also. We have voting as a last resort. When all attempts to arrive at decisions through consensus have failed, then you have a process. So here we cannot the veto power that we have right now by default is the most dangerous, and that is what is causing the deadlock at this point, and progressing and stalling progress. So if you look at the UNFCCC, for instance, or the Rotterdam Convention, they illustrate how the lack of voting mechanism leads to decades of stagnation and failure to meet objectives, right? And we do not want a repeat of that in the plastics treaty. So Rotterdam, for instance, the issue of and CSC follows the issue of asbestos and has been for a long time, and we know how it is stalled. Every time one country, they take turns in progressing, in vetoing the addition of asbestos for a phase out, right? And something like that could happen in the plastics treaty also if we do not have a voting process in there. So yeah, so I think that's why it's important to have a clear voting mechanism in decision making in MEAs.
Yeah, I fully agree with Dharmesh, and I don't see a path for a very ambitious treaty if the consensus approach prevails up until the very end. But that said, the balance that high ambition countries, or at least most of them, need to make is, to what extent do they, put their efforts behind protecting a bit the UN convened multilateral space, where of course, like with all negotiations, it's ultimately a compromise between different positions. So to what extent does that what is the weight that they put to that into this process versus the need to really decide on some measures that will potentially damage the economic interests of several petrochemical countries, but with a purpose to do what the treaty is meant to do, which is to protect the health of humans and the environment from plastic pollution. So this is exactly, I think, the balancing that will need to be made, and it's definitely a very tricky one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lars, Dharmesh, and Atin for trying to shed some light on this very important issue. I was also speaking to someone who does follow a lot of these multilateral environmental agreements, and they had a very different view on why voting should be embedded in these processes, because the whole idea is to use the vote as a threat at the expense of maybe not moving forward at all. So, the vote can always be, kind of pegged at these countries who are resistant to change, saying that, we cannot be discussing the same issue over and over and over again. And we will go ahead with a vote, which will drive some movement, which we have, a movement that we've seen a lack of, at least in the plastic treaty negotiations. Now, this brings me to a very interesting point of financing. Now, this time, unlike the last 4 INCs, what we saw is developed and developing countries, I mean, the divide between these two blocks was it was the most evident of all the four INCs that we've seen, at least for me. The panelists can correct me if my understanding is wrong. We saw a group of 37 developed nations putting forth a proposal saying that we should be using existing funds for basically undertaking activities that would be mandated by this future treaty. And on the other hand, we saw about 93 to 95 developing countries, although they did not put one single proposal, but all of them demanded a dedicated fund for financing this treaty. So in this, with this as the background, I mean, does the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which was, I think, introduced back in 1992 during the Rio Declaration, but has been actively exercised in the UNFCCC climate space. So does that argument also stand here? And what really can be seen as a bridge? I mean, we in the current text as it stands, we've seen that EPR is an option for financing. The global plastic pollution fee is still on the table, up for discussions. So could you, Lars and Dharmesh, throw some light on the financing aspects? Because I think this is very important for the treaty to be implemented.
Yes, thanks, Siddharth. I'll go first this time. Yes, I mean, certainly financing was one of those issues that is becoming very contentious here, as it has been in other processes like the UNFCCC process, and in that just closed the week before after some very intense discussions on financing. And I think that the two main issues are whether to establish a dedicated fund or whether to use existing mechanisms such as the Global Environment Facility. I think the front lines are perhaps, I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but it's mainly sort of between the EU, or at least the EU leading on behalf of developed nations, and in particularly the Africa group on behalf of the developing nations. And I think what of course, what the developing countries are demanding is that developed countries pick up most of the bill for developing countries to be able to implement the measures in the future agreement. I think, well, this is another very interesting one to follow in next time. My sense is that there is still a recognition of the common but differentiated responsibilities principle, but not at every cost, let's say. I think what developed countries and the EU in particular is looking for is a level of commitment on the part of developing countries to make sure that whatever financing is provided, whether it's through a dedicated fund or existing funds, that is not so much the question, but that the financing that is provided is contributing to or has a catalytic effect, meaning that there should be a level of commitment on the part of developing countries to implement measures and mechanisms, financing measures and mechanisms within, or at the country level, so that it becomes this finance becomes sustainable. In other words, put in place EPR or other forms of fees, or others, through taxes, or so that it's not a one-way financing stream, let's say, but that the whole sort of financing landscape around this is sort of put on the path of sustainable sustainable finance to implement the measures in the agreement, to finance waste management, legacy plastics, etc. So that's basically my understanding of this, but I am happy to be complimented by Dharmesh and yourself as well. Thank you.
Dharmesh?
Just to add, I think, yeah, that's the main kind of, politics that played around in this, and there was a lot of the developed countries dynamic, and that I think we were expecting some of this, looking at how the CBD COP went and how the Baku discussions went. So the question moving forward is, where will the money come from? And if this deadlock continues, of course, dedicated fund versus existing fund is just one of the many issues that we need to sort out. But even if we have a treaty and that requires funding, are developed countries, donor countries, equipped to commit money to this fund? And then once they make a commitment, will they see the commitment through? So that remains a very large question, and certainly on top of our heads, minds, as countries who come from the global south, at will this ever happen? So that, having said that, just a quick note on the other mechanisms, because here we have a very strong case to be made on polluter pays principle, and what Lars spoke about, the fees and the EPR mechanisms. And I think there's a very strong case in the plastics treaty to mobilize a lot of private sector finance. At this point, we have something that that country of Ghana has proposed, what they call the polymer fee, where the country is proposing a premium on the amount of polymers that are produced, a small fee, and that fee contributes to significantly, actually, the amount of the calculations that were done by some of the researchers who developed the whole idea, is that it can raise about $25 to $35 billion a year by imposing a very small fee on polymers produced by some of the major manufacturers. And there are only about 100 or so major manufacturers of polymers in the world. So it's a very easy fee. It's a very easy mechanism to raise funds, and all this money gets collected and sent to a global fund, and then it gets redistributed based on the CBDR principle that Lars was talking about. So countries in the global south will receive more money from this fund, and countries that have no manufacturing capacity, like PSIDS or small island developing countries, AOSIS, they are net recipients in this. So it's a very robust mechanism. It's a bit unconventional, so we didn't see much support for this from countries. But at this point, I don't see how countries cannot put their weight behind this idea, because we do not see donor countries giving as much as they can in the plastics treaty. Of course, as I said, looking at how things have played out in the climate and the CBD COPs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lars and Dharmesh. I think I was also speaking to one of the delegations from one of the developed countries. I'll not name this country, but they were very strongly mentioning that, we are ready to fund a treaty, and that's how we see the language on a dedicated fund still up for discussion. But the whole idea was, if the treaty is weakened by a handful of countries, that is a problem for us to finance. We will not be ready to finance a weak treaty. But if you make the treaty a bit more stronger, actually have some elements of action there, that would really, does that make sense to you, Lars, Dharmesh? Of this argument of, we are ready to fund a stronger treaty, but if the treaty is weak, we may not fund it at all.
Yeah, to me it makes complete sense, because it's exactly the catalytic effect that financing should have. I mean, there's no way that any developed country is going to sort of put resources to finance a problem that is just growing and growing and growing, right? So, in other words, I think what they're looking for is a treaty that really then starts to really tackle this problem by reducing the amount of primary plastics produced, by reducing plastic waste entering the environment, by reducing the harmful effects on humans, etc. So I mean, yeah, that makes sense to me. Maybe what I'll just throw in is that, of course, the polluter pays principle, is recognized, but it's going to mean that the cost of plastic products are going to increase as well, because right now they are heavily subsidized. It's an incredibly cheap product, and compared to the effects that it has, when it enters the environment. So there are several dynamics here, and we'll just have to see how far they come, by the end of the next round of negotiations.
Yeah. Dharmesh, anything that you want to add?
I forgot the question. Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, about the argument that the developed countries are ready to fund a strong treaty, but they might not agree to a dedicated fund if the treaty is weakened by a
Yeah.
small group of countries.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, just what Lars said was, the problem of waste will be bottomless if we do not have production cuts. So a weak treaty would be a waste management treaty, which is what some of countries, the low ambition countries are asking for, which means they're seeking money to invest in waste management. And we've looked at past 50 years, no matter how much money you invest in waste management, the waste problem is not going to go away. And this is not just, I'm not talking about the waste, like countries like India, when we say waste, we see it like, flowing in the rivers. And so it's like we associate that pollution with the plastic crisis, and rightly so. But in countries that are clean, that have enough money and they invest billions of dollars in waste management, they are still struggling with waste issues. And what they've done, in fact, is they've started exporting their waste to the global south. And that's how they've dealt with it, because they have the money to do that. So Europe, US, Canada, a lot of these, Japan, a lot of these countries are investing all their money into collecting the waste, making sure that they don't go into the rivers and local water bodies and the land. They pack it in containers and send it abroad. So they've not solved the problem. They have just displaced it. So we know that even if money comes in through this treaty, and if countries in the global north invest money in this treaty, and if it's just a waste management treaty, it'll just be money down the drain. Because no matter how much money you put in, no matter how many incinerators we build or landfills we build, it's going to be a bottomless issue. So yeah, just to kind of complement what Lars said.
Yeah, thank you, Lars and Dharmesh. I think we have enough evidence in terms of how the production of this particular material has been rising over the last few decades, and it will continue to rise if it is not basically looked at from a critical point of view. Now, this brings me to my last question, and it is absolutely for both of you. We've seen that the last 3 consecutive talks in multilateral environmental agreements have failed, from Cali to Baku and now in Busan. It also kind of talks about a changing world order, where a handful of countries are saying that, we know what's good for us, and let us not be instructed by other people what we have to do, what is good for our economies, what is good for our interests. but rather, we tell you that this is what we will do and this is the timeline, which is pretty much the climate what basically happens in the climate space. So my last question to you is, this definitely was, everyone was expecting a text for in this round of negotiations. But what will it take to ensure that the next meeting, whenever and wherever it is held, uh, will actually give us a text that we need, and not a weak text, but a text that is really needed for seeing some action. Will it be, will it be the consensus versus the voting debate? Will it be the chemicals of concern that needs to be resolved? Will it be the production caps that probably would need to see some compromise from either of the parties? Let me rephrase the question: is what are the three issues that, according to both of you, need to be resolved in order for the world to actually arrive at a treaty in the next meeting?
Okay, I'll go first if that's okay. I wasn't prepared to list three issues, but I'll try to capture that. I disagree a bit that Busan was a failure, simply because in reality the starting point before Busan was better than it was after INC4, but it was also just a starting point, and to negotiate and agree something like that in essentially in 7 days. Of course, there have been discussions before, but 7 days for a text was always going to be hard. I think what we need to watch is, as you say, the consensus versus the voting. I don't think that we will achieve, or I think we agree that we will not achieve a very ambitious treaty by consensus. So it depends on the extent to which countries are willing to tackle this sort of issue around voting and really proceed to a vote among the countries of the willing. In other words, the high ambition countries plus several others. So that's number one. I think what we also need, what I think it will also take, is that that countries look at the treaty, to be agreed next time as a start of something more long term. In other words, what we term a start. What do you call it? A start and strengthen approach. So defer some decisions to the COP of the plastics treaty. We're seeing some of that in text already. For example, around a global production target, which well, of course, we all want to take a decision on that as soon as possible, and a strong decision. But maybe it's a decision that is worth giving a bit of time so that it can be taken at the first conference of parties. So I think what I do not want to see is the high ambition countries compromising in ways that prevent the discussions to be continued and had later. So in that sense, I think a start and strengthen approach, where some decisions are taken now but others are taken later, is probably the way to go. And yeah, but as I said, I think while we all sort of want to agree and sort of unpack all the issues, I think there should not be compromises on things, on any measure that can truly contribute to the problem. So whether you achieve well, so there are different ways of course, achieving a reduction in production by looking at product design and recycling and reuse systems and so on. So we need these measures in the treaty, because if not, it's the problem is simply going to grow and grow and grow and grow. So yeah, we need to stand up, continue to stand up for ambition until we are not able to stand anymore. So thank you. Over to Damesh.
Yeah, I think the three, just to add to that, the three key issues will be production reduction, which is the obligation on production reduction, the chemicals of concern, financial mechanisms, and voting in the COP. Now, these are the four most contentious issues at this point. And we're looking at a very hard kind of a divide between countries, looking at on these four issues. Now, the problem is that there is also the consensus and voting issue in the INC rules of procedure, which is what is stalling a lot of the progress on the treaty text. Now, there, what all the references I made earlier to consensus being weaponized by certain group of countries was in the INC process itself. And here, because the rules of procedure are still and there's a bit of complication on how they're being applied at this point. So by default, the whole process is being run by consensus. And one of the reasons we're seeing a lack of progress on the treaty text is because the rules of procedure that govern the decision making within the INC process is complicated right now, and where consensus is being weaponized by certain countries. That said, we hope that we come to an agreement and or some kind of a situation in the future INCs. We don't know how many there will be in at this point, but at some point I think we'll have to come and answer that hard question. So how do we want to decide on the text that goes into this? So we waiting for high ambition countries or certain countries to at least start developing a strategy on dealing with this whole issue of decision making in the INC process. The COP decision, which is once the INC decides on the text, then the text will be sent to what is called the Conference of Plenipotentiaries for signatures. And then ratification process begins, and then the COPs begin, COP 1, COP 2, COP 3. So that process will happen once the signature ratification happens. And that decision-making is also, countries are also contending that should also be by consensus, which is a different debate as well. And where, again, is dangerous, like Lars said, not to have a consensus-based thing only. And we have to have language in the final text, which talks about consensus to the extent possible, and then if all efforts fail, then there has to be an option for voting in the COP as well. So yeah, so those are the four main issues I think will be interesting to see how they evolve in the future COPs and future INCs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dharmesh and Lars, for those pointers. I now will hand it back to Atin to take over a few questions if we have any.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. So there are some questions have already been answered by the panel, including Siddharth. I will take as many as possible. We have about 7 minutes, which will take us to 4:15. The first question is for Lars. You mentioned that the establishment of a level playing field is necessary, or the lack of it is a challenge. You also mentioned that some larger corporations are doing a lot on sustainability while others have not. Can you give some examples of companies that have also established good practices? Because currently it seems there are heavily lobbying at the INCs to avoid mandatory regulations.
Well, yes, thanks. I may not be able to name companies, but I think some of them are, some of these, and you can look up the Business Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. I don't think any company is perfect. Let's just say that. I mean, so whether the fact that they are members of the Business Coalition does not mean that they go to the full extent of sustainability practice. But just to make a clarification, the countries that are really lobbying very hard in the process against mandatory measures are the petrochemical companies. So, and Damesh mentioned some of them, and they've come together in groups like the American Chemistry Council, etc. So, but I think all, in fact, all companies, probably also many of the companies in the business coalition, would be challenged by some of the measures that are being proposed in the treaty. But it's, again, as I said, it's about making that playing field more level, so that countries operate on the same, similar regulatory regimes and so on. Thanks.
Thanks, Lars. I can see Siddharth is responding the next one, so let me skip this one. The next one, the panel, anyone can take it. What will be the key pillars of India to agree on the plastics treaty? How is CBDR relevant in Indian context? And how do you see India balance its pollution challenge with action upstream? Anyone in the panel?
Siddharth, I think, should answer this. We don't know. Indian delegation doesn't speak to us at all, so I don't know.
I don't think they speak to anyone.
I think the next one on polymer fee can be taken up by Dharmesh, and I will try to respond to this by typing in an answer. So, Dharmesh, the question is, what is the polymer fee going to be used for?
Yeah.
If you can just.
Yeah. So just to also quickly answer the previous question, is just joking, but I think the key pillars for India, if India wants to be ambitious in this particular negotiations, then they need to have a rationalized approach to production reduction, because it is in line with what India has been doing so far in calling for ban on single-use plastics. Our legislations are some of the most progressive ones. So at this point, I think it's in India's interest to come to agree to come to a meeting point, or at least a landing zone on the issue of production reduction, at least looking at that, and also on chemicals. So there, of course, India is leading the charge on common but differentiated responsibility, as it has done in the other negotiation spaces also. And as one of the largest kind of growing economies and developing country, I think CBDR kind of is relevant, especially when it comes to financial mechanism, the money that needs to come in from the historic polluters. Yes, to all those things. But there needs to be also a rational argument to be made for India to develop some thinking on phase out targets, like we did with the Montreal Protocol on CFCs and HCFCs. We need to have some thinking on certain polymers at least. This is not, and some of the misconceptions that we're seeing in these negotiations are also need to be addressed here, because we are looking at a lot of countries saying that this treaty is about banning all plastics. It is not true. It is not about banning all plastics. It is about banning problematic and unnecessary plastics, and also a rational phase out of certain plastics that are being manufactured at this point. And there's an acknowledgement across the world that there's overproduction. So we need to address that issue head on at this point. So that from that point of view, I think India is in a position where it can be a leader in taking a progressive stand. So far, we have not seen them do that, unfortunately, but I think we hope that they would moving forward. On the issue of fee, the amount that I referred to, 25 to 35 billion, is not, it's so that the fee is not a control measure. It's not supposed to reduce the production of plastic. It's just supposed to fund or find or meet or bridge the financial gap that is envisaged in the future. So this money will go towards waste management, will go towards addressing legacy plastic pollution, cleanup, hotspots where plastic accumulation has happened or pollution is ongoing, to address health impacts of plastic pollution upstream and downstream, just transition. So once you have an agreement on a treaty that will phase out plastics, there's a whole economy that has grown around plastics, because plastic is such an important part of life now. And those jobs need to be the loss of jobs has to be addressed, and that just transition process is something that can be financed through the money that comes from the fee as well, which includes waste pickers and waste workers across the value chain of plastics, etc.
Yeah. I think we have exhausted the time that we had. In fact, we have exceeded the time by about good 15 minutes. It was a very enriching conversation, to say the least. A lot of nuances of the key takeaways from the Busan's 5th INC is a lot more clear to all of us now. And like the panel mentioned, that it's a very complex geopolitics, like every other multilateral environment agreement. But yes, if the treaty is to cover the full life cycle of plastic, then there has to be some element in the upstream and the midstream surviving whenever, even if there is one more INC, let's say INC 5.4, whenever it happens. Otherwise, like Dharmesh mentioned, it will just become a waste management treaty, and probably the purpose of the treaty will be defeated, and it will have its ripple effect on everything else. We'll continue this conversation. I'm sure the panel will also be there for the next INC, wherever it happens, whenever it happens. We missed few questions. I would request Siddharth to kind of get back to the colleagues who raised these questions. And we thank you for being with us. And probably with this, our long journey to follow INC and the discussions around the Global Plastic Treaty, we released our report. There was a series of 3 webinars ahead of the INC. And we did a side event where fortunately we had Lars there. And definitely, wherever we are, even the observers group have more than representative from more than 100 countries across the world. So we have to continue our engagement with our own delegation or wherever we can to kind of communicate the concern. Again, everything comes back as a battle between economy and environment. And there has to be a balance. It's not easy. Every country would try to protect their national interest ahead of anything else, just like every multilateral environment. So on this note, let us appreciate that Busan was not a complete failure like Lars mentioned. We did have some progress. And if you look at the history of all multilateral environment agreements, probably the INC or the Global Plastic Treaty made it to the text or near to the text at in the quickest possible time as compared to the all MES in the history. So on that note, I thank all the panelists, Lars, Dharmesh, and Siddharth. Thank you guys for your time and very insightful discussion. And we will continue this engagement and we'll continue being in touch with all of you. On that note, let us conclude today's webinar. Thank you all so much. Please stay safe and take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.